we are going to start by implementing structured logging using Serilog. The first thing I'm going to do is to install the required libraries for configuring and running Serilog. So let's add the NuGet packages in the API project, and I'm going to browse for Serilog. Serilog is a logging library for .NET, and it has native support for structured logging. Structured logging is a logging approach where you enrich your application logs with additional structured data. You're going to see how we will use this in just a moment, but let's start by installing the correct libraries. So I'm going to look for Serilog ASP.NET Core because it has excellent integration with our runtime. I'm also going to look for one more library, and this is the Serilog Seek Sync. Serilog has a concept of syncs, which are just connectors to your log ingestion sources, and Seek is a structured logging server that we're going to run and is going to take in our application logs and represent them in a dashboard so that we can easily filter and analyze the application logs. Let's go ahead and install the Serilog Syncs Seek library. The next thing we want to do is to configure Serilog with dependency injection. I'm going to start by accessing our web application builder, and I'm going to access the host property so that we can configure our host builder. We now have an extension method available that's called use Serilog, and I'm going to use an overload of this method that gives me access to the host builder context and the logger configuration. And what I'm going to do with this is to configure my Serilog configuration from my application settings. So I'm going to say configuration, and then we're going to say read from, and I can call the configuration method. Now I can use my host builder context to provide the iConfiguration instance so that Serilog can be configured from the application settings. And with this in place, we are almost ready to start using Serilog. We only need to add the required configuration in the application settings JSON file, and Serilog will be able to pick up the configuration and apply the required settings. While I'm still in the program file, I'm also going to add some Serilog middleware that's going to be useful for us, and this is the Serilog request logging middleware. You can add it to your request logging pipeline by calling the use Serilog request logging method, and this is going to introduce a middleware that's going to hook into my incoming API requests and start logging useful information about the processing of my API requests, such as the status codes, request times, any exceptions, and so on. So now that we have Serilog request logging enabled and we set up Serilog to read the configuration from the application settings, the only thing that's remaining is to add the actual configuration values in the application settings JSON file. I'm going to replace the logging section that I have here with a Serilog section that I already prepared, and I'm going to walk you through what I am configuring here. The Serilog configuration section contains a few properties. The first section is the using array, and if you hover over it, you can even see some documentation about what should live inside of this section. What we are going to do is to define an array of syncs that we want to configure with Serilog. So I'm adding the Serilog console sync and also the Seek sync, which we installed as an additional NuGet package. Then we have the minimum level section, where we can define the threshold for the minimum log level. I'm setting the default log level to information, and you can easily change this to a higher logging level, such as warning or error, and you can also override the log level for specific namespaces. Then we have the write to section, where we configure the syncs that we will be writing our log events to. So this is the console sync, you just have to specify the console sync name. And then we have the Seek sync, where we need to configure the server URL where the Seek instance is running. So you can see that this is pointing to some HTTP address where I'm exposing the Seek structured logging server, and we are going to run this inside of a Docker container. I'm going to show you how we will configure this container in just a moment, but I first want to cover one more section in the Serilog configuration, and this is the enrich section. It defines the enrichers that we are going to apply to our log events, and the most important one is the log context enricher, which allows you to add structured properties to the Serilog log context, and they will be available for the duration of that log context's lifetime, and this will typically be an HTTP request in our API. I'm also adding the machine name and the thread ID enrichers, but these are less important. You also want to remove the logging section from the default application settings JSON file, so that the only remaining one is the Serilog section in my application settings development JSON. I mentioned that we will configure a Docker container to run the Seek structured logging server. So let's open up the Docker Compose YAML file, and add the required service to spin up our Seek instance. I'm going to give the service the name of Bookify Seek. This is also the same value that I'm using in my server URL HTTP address pointing to my Seek instance. I also configured the Seek port to be 5341, and you can see that I'm mapping this as the default port in the Seek container. I'm also exposing the Seek dashboard on the 8081 port on my local machine. The actual Docker image that I'm going to use to run my Seek instance is the datalast Seek image, and when we start our Docker Compose instance, we will pull this image and spin up a new container instance. I'm also giving it a concrete name to follow the convention that I was using with my previous services. So let's start our API with Docker Compose, and I'm going to open up the Docker desktop application where you can see the Seek instance spinning up slowly. If we navigate into the Seek instance, you can see that the server is running. So let's navigate to the Seek dashboard and see what we have available there. This is the Seek dashboard that's now available on localhost 8081, and you can already see that we have some logs when we start the application. If you open up the logs, you can see a lot of contextual information, and this is actually the structured log values. If I open up Postman for a moment, and I send a post request to log in the user, then I'm going to use this JSON Web Token to obtain the information for the current user. So I'm setting the new token value, sending this request, and we get back the user information. And now let's head back to our Seek dashboard. If I refresh the application logs, you can see that we have a lot more information here. And for example, here is the log for our API users/me endpoint that we just called. And you can see that the source context here is the request logging middleware. So this is our Serolog request logging. And the real power of structured logs is that you can filter all of these logs here based on the structured log properties. So for example, I can filter the source context to be Serolog ASP.NET Core request logging middleware, and then I'm going to get back the specific logs that match this source context. You can also use the request ID property on your application logs as a sort of a correlation ID. So for example, I can filter by the request ID, and then I'm going to get all of the application logs for this particular API request. So you can see our request coming in and hitting the API users/me endpoint. Then you can see the SQL queries that are executed behind the scenes. For example, this is the query to fetch the user's roles. Then we have another query to fetch the user's permissions, and then you can see the remaining logs here where we are returning the API response. And for example, you can see how long it took to complete the API request. What we implemented so far as supporting structured logging is great, but we can make it even better. And if you're wondering how I'm going to make the structured logs better, we're going to do two things. First of all, I'm going to add a middleware to introduce a correlation ID to all of my structured logs. So let's add another class here, and I'm going to call it the request context logging middleware. I'm going to use the conventional approach to define my middleware. So I'm going to inject a request delegate instance, and let's call it next. I'm going to initialize this from my constructor, and then I need to define an asynchronous method returning a task, and it can be named invoke or invoke async. This method should accept an HTTP context instance that it can use to process the request delegate. What I'm going to do inside of this middleware is define a using statement, and inside of the using statement, I'm going to create my log context. I'm going to access the log context static class from Serolog, and I'll call the push property method. And the property that I'm going to push into my log context is the correlation ID, and I'm going to get the value for this correlation ID from the get correlation ID method. This method is going to take in an HTTP context instance, and the push property method returns a disposable instance, which is why I'm using a using statement. I'm going to wrap my API request into the body of the using statement so that my log context lives for the duration of the API request. And I'm just going to call my request delegate and return the respective task from my invoke method. And now let's go ahead and implement my get correlation ID method. So this will be a static method called get correlation ID, and it accepts an HTTP context as the argument. I'm also going to define a constant that's going to represent my correlation ID header name, And this is because I want to pull my correlation ID from the respective request header if it exists. Otherwise, we are going to generate a value for the correlation ID. We're going to access the request value by taking in the HTTP context and then using the request property. And then I can access the headers collection, and I'll try to get a value with this key. So let's pass in the correlation ID header name and capture the correlation ID in an out variable. So I'll say that this is the correlation ID. Then I'm going to call correlation ID first or default. And if this doesn't exist, I'm going to use the HTTP context trace identifier property as the correlation ID value for my request. So this implementation gives me the flexibility of either taking in the correlation ID externally from another service talking with my API, allowing me to trace a single request across multiple services in a microservice environment. Otherwise, if this header isn't present, then we're going to use the trace identifier for this API request. Then I'm going to define an extension method to register my middleware. I'm going to call it use request context logging, and it's just going to call the use middleware method and specify my middleware as the middleware that we are adding to the request pipeline. Then I'll go to my program file and call this method right before calling use Serolog request logging. So I'm first going to push the correlation ID into the log context and then execute the remaining middleware in my HTTP request pipeline. So the request context logging middleware that we just added will allow us to add a correlation